July 1944, Camp Aliceville, Alabama. Noon heat pressed straight down on the red clay, the pine pitch hanging sweet in the air, cicadas soaring a hard rhythm against the wire. From the eastern gate came a deeper, unfamiliar hum, not the rasp of a deuce and a half with canvas sides, but the steady thrum of a sealed olive-drab van with louvers and bright metal fittings. The Wehrmacht prisoners, men taken at Tunisia and Bizerte, men who had learned to read a convoy at a glance, tracked it with silent calculation and found no answer they recognized. When the rear hatch lifted, a white plume rolled out, cold and stinging. Dry ice. Inside, metal tubs shone like cannon breeches. Vanilla, not ammunition, not bread, not salt meat, ice cream. The guards called it morale food and waved the paper spoons as a joke, but the shock lived behind the wire. The German non-commissioned officer thought of Kassel in 1941, when ration cards began to shrink and dairy slipped from shop windows. Another remembered a child's summer on the Weser and could not fix the distance between that memory and this place. Men counted without meaning to. The tubs, the ladles, the servings, the way the cold bit the lip, the way the sugar rose after months of shipboard coffee and camp stew. The Quartermaster Corps had hauled it across a continent in insulated trucks, packed in CO2 snow that burned the fingertips and kept the cargo near freezing. Even the numbers felt unreal in a war measured by calibers and tonnage. The van's compressor clicked off, and the hum gave way to insects and the dull clink of tins. In the heat, the cold sweetness melted into a new kind of disbelief, the taste of an enemy's abundance, and with it the question that would frame everything that followed: how did wartime America make this luxury routine? By the closing months of 1943, America's quiet heartland had become the unexpected destination for a defeated army. Over 400,000 Axis prisoners, most of them German, with smaller contingents of Italians and a handful of Japanese, had crossed the Atlantic under the stars and stripes, packed into Liberty ships that had once ferried tanks and grain. When the hatches opened at East Coast ports, the men stepped into a world that contradicted everything they had been told. From there, long trains pushed south and west, distributing them across nearly every U.S. state. Camps like Aliceville in Alabama, Ruston in Louisiana, and McCoy in Wisconsin grew almost overnight. Laid out with military precision, barracks in rows, mess halls, infirmaries, recreation fields, and guard towers rising above the pines or prairie. Each camp was a miniature town, enclosed but efficient, governed under the Geneva Convention's every clause. For many of the German prisoners, especially those of the Africa Corps, captured under Rommel's banner, the shock began at first sight. They had expected barbed cruelty, starvation, and humiliation, the grim harvest of propaganda that had painted Americans as decadent and vindictive. Instead, they found structure, sanitation, and even a measure of dignity. The infirmary treated wounds with sulfur powder and clean dressings. Libraries stocked both Goethe and translated Mark Twain. Barracks were issued blankets, soap, and heating fuel. A corporal from Bremen wrote later that it resembled a disciplined village, not a prison. Behind this civility lay calculation. The U.S. War Department saw humane treatment not as charity, but as a weapon, moral warfare. By upholding the Geneva Convention, America aimed to prove the superiority of democratic principles, while ensuring that American captives in Europe might receive reciprocal care. Food, in particular, became the front line of this policy. Quartermaster regulations set caloric rations between 3,200 and 3,600 per day, comparable to or greater than those allotted to U.S. soldiers, in training and well above what most civilians, on ration stamps and wartime restrictions, could expect. The daily rhythm of balanced meals, butter, bread, and occasional fruit created a strange moral inversion. The conquered ate better than many of the conqueror's own citizens. It was within this atmosphere of organized abundance that something as improbable as ice cream could emerge, not as luxury but as logistics. The same system that could deliver artillery to North Africa could just as easily deliver dessert to Alabama. And in that efficiency lay the next revelation: how comfort itself became institutionalized within the American military machine. By 1944, the machinery that fed and supplied the United States military had become one of the greatest logistical systems in human history. Beneath the camouflage of warehouses and convoys, lay a scale of organization almost invisible to the public eye. The Quartermaster Corps, the branch that turned industrial power into sustenance. Every sunrise, it fed more than 12 million men scattered from Iceland to the South Pacific. Its reach spanned oceans. Its timetables synchronized ships, trains, and trucks with mathematical precision. From the docks of Norfolk to the jungle trails of New Guinea, the same olive-drab crates carried everything a modern army required: beans, bullets, boots, and, improbably, ice cream. The secret was refrigeration, an achievement as strategic as radar or code-breaking. Early in the war, Quartermaster engineers developed a web of mobile refrigeration plants and insulated rail cars that could move perishable food through climates where meat once spoiled within hours. Compressors, powered by portable diesel generators, kept milk cold across hundreds of miles. By 1944, they were producing over 7,000 tons of refrigerated goods per day. Among those goods was a morale ration, officially sanctioned in field manuals: ice cream. It carried little nutritional value, but immense psychological weight. Commanders had discovered that a dish of frozen sweetness after combat steadied nerves, reminded soldiers of home and, in a word favored by planners, civilized war. Field kitchens soon acquired their own small wonders of engineering. Machines like the Taylor Freezer Model 41, compact, steel, and driven by 5-horsepower gasoline engines, could freeze and churn 10 gallons of dessert an hour in desert heat or aboard a carrier deck. Cream, sugar, and flavoring extracts came through regional contracts with American dairies, Borden's in the Midwest, Pet Dairy Company in the South, Carnation in the West. Each delivery followed a pattern of near-perfect predictability, guided by refrigeration trucks whose thermostats could hold temperatures near 20-degree Fahrenheit for days on end. The same convoys that carried frozen meat to the Pacific also supplied army hospitals in Kansas and, eventually, prisoner-of-war camps deep in Alabama and Louisiana. For American planners, the presence of ice cream at a POW camp was not extravagance. It was proof of control, evidence that their system worked even at the war's edges. But for the men behind the wire, those trucks seemed to belong to another world entirely. A world where even in war, the enemy could afford to waste cold on pleasure. As the Quartermaster convoy rolled past the pines toward Aliceville, its hum signaled more than delivery. It announced the arrival of abundance in a place built for deprivation. June 1944, Camp Aliceville, Alabama. The morning sun pressed down through a haze of humidity, heavy with the smell of cut grass and pine resin. Along the dirt lanes between barracks, German prisoners in faded field gray moved under guard toward the mess hall, summoned earlier than usual. Rumors flickered among them. An inspection, perhaps, or new rations from the Quartermaster depot. Inside, the air hung thick with steam and the metallic scent of tin trays. On each tray lay the familiar shapes of an American meal: meatloaf browned at the edges, mashed potatoes glossed with butter, a ladle of gravy pooling in the corner. But beside it, resting in a small metal bowl, was something no one could identify, pale, smooth, and beading with droplets that slid down the sides. The first spoons rose hesitantly. The texture resisted, then gave way to sweetness and cold that shocked the tongue. For an instant the mess fell silent. It was ice cream, real rich American ice cream, dense with cream, faint with vanilla, as foreign to these men as the language on the guards' uniforms. One sergeant from the 15th Panzer Division blinked hard, convinced it must be some nutritional paste or medical ration. Another prisoner, a Luftwaffe mechanic from Cologne, whispered later in his diary that he thought it was a test. Surely they will punish us for eating it. But no punishment came. Instead, the guards simply ate their own portions, joked about flavors, and moved on. Word spread fast across the compound. By evening, every barracks knew. "We eat like kings in defeat," one diary recorded, while another noted the bitter irony that America could spare milk and sugar for its captives when German children were surviving on ersatz bread and turnip soup. Letters home, heavily censored yet threaded with disbelief, hinted at the same revelation, that the enemy's prosperity was not propaganda. The ice cream at Aliceville became more than dessert. It was proof that the United States fought a war it could afford to make humane. For the prisoners, that realization melted slower than the ice itself, seeping into every thought about the world beyond the wire, and what it meant to have lost to such abundance. By late summer 1944, stories of the ice cream rations had drifted far beyond the fences of Camp Aliceville. Across the vast network of American POW compounds, from the cotton plains of Texas to the red hills of Oklahoma, German prisoners spoke of it as if describing a myth. Bowls of cold dessert served under an enemy flag, guards laughing as though it were the most ordinary thing in the world. Letters screened by censors still carried fragments of astonishment homeward. "We are treated correctly, even luxuriously," one Afrika Korps private wrote. Another described fruit butter, cigarettes, and something frozen called ice creme. The Red Cross channels carried these accounts onward, and soon German intelligence analysts in Berlin were reading reports that contradicted their own propaganda. Ice cream, they scoffed, was surely an embellishment. Yet privately, Wehrmacht officers tasked with morale feared the implications. If such stories were true, how could a nation that lived under air raids believe that the enemy suffered at all? Among the prisoners themselves, the effect was disorienting. Many had been taught that Allied abundance was hollow, a facade built on decadence and moral decay. Yet here, on the edge of an Alabama field, the abundance was real, tangible, and cold to the touch. A former U-boat engineer later recalled that the ice cream did more to break the spell of propaganda than any interrogation. The paradox gnawed quietly. The enemy who bombed their cities also offered them comfort. The conqueror who fed them sugar when Germany's bakeries were rubble, American officers noticed too. Army psychologists attached to the office of the Provost Marshal General observed measurable changes in prisoner behavior after such morale feedings. Discipline improved. Work details filled faster. Conflicts between factions lessened. Reports from camps in Texas and Louisiana even used a phrase that stuck, "ice cream day," to describe the period of calm that followed each delivery. The War Department recognized the pattern and without fanfare codified it. Humane indulgence was strategy. A dish of ice cream had become a weapon of influence, one that required neither rifle nor radio, only refrigeration. From this realization would grow an entire branch of logistical innovation devoted to keeping that cold chain unbroken. By the summer of 1944, the humble bowl of ice cream that appeared behind barbed wire owed its existence to one of the most complex supply systems ever built. Beneath the apparent simplicity of a frozen dessert lay the coordination of depots, dairies, engines, and engineers stretched across the American South. Quartermaster Depot No. 9 in New Orleans stood at the heart of that network, its warehouses stacked high with drums of condensed milk, crates of sugar, and pallets of frozen concentrate. Each week, insulated convoys rolled out from its gates, their destinations marked not only as bases and hospitals, but as prisoner-of-war camps scattered through Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. Refrigerated rail cars fed the system, carrying Gulf Coast dairy products inland under the watch of inspectors armed with thermometers and checklists as precise as any artillery manifest. At Camp Aliceville, as in hundreds of other installations, the mess halls became laboratories of controlled cold. Each compound maintained its own ice storage system, a squat shed filled with insulated panels and powered by ammonia compression units capable of keeping desserts frozen for 72 hours in southern heat. Quartermaster engineers had anticipated such needs early, designing ice cream mix kits that could travel anywhere. Tins of powdered milk, sugar, emulsifiers, and flavorings sealed in wax-lined boxes. Add clean water, churn with mechanical mixers, chill, and within an hour the result was a frozen ration indistinguishable from cream-based ice cream. It was efficiency disguised as indulgence. By 1945, the numbers had become staggering. Over 20 million gallons of ice cream produced for American forces across the globe. Factories in Chicago, St. Louis, and Dallas ran around the clock to meet demand, their output feeding both frontline mess tents and homefront camps. The trucks that made the final leg of the journey were feats of engineering themselves. Converted Dodge 212-ton transports refitted with double-walled insulation and mechanical compressors, their thermostats holding the cargo steady below 20 degrees F, 6 degrees Celsius, even when the Alabama air shimmered above 90. To American logisticians, such precision proved industrial supremacy. To the prisoners, it was a revelation of another kind. One German recalled years later, "They fight with machines, feed with machines, and even freeze their happiness with machines." In those words lay both awe and resignation, the realization that the same technology that fueled the Allied advance also powered the small luxuries of captivity. From that recognition emerged the next chapter in this unlikely story, how generosity, discipline, and cold efficiency combined to reshape the prisoners' behavior and even their cooperation with Allied intelligence. By mid-1944, America's factories and fields strained under the weight of war. With more than 12 million men overseas, farms across the South and Midwest faced empty rows, unpicked cotton, and silent canneries. The War Manpower Commission, desperate to keep production flowing, turned to an unexpected reserve of labor, the German prisoners scattered across the nation's interior. Under the Geneva Convention's Article 27, they could work voluntarily, provided they were paid and fed according to humane standards. It was a solution born of necessity, but executed with remarkable order. Token wages, typically 80 cents per day, were credited to camp canteens, while civilian contractors transported teams of POWs to nearby farms, lumber mills, and food plants. What made the system function, however, went beyond rules. It was trust in food. Camp Aliceville's ice cream, once a curiosity, became a subtle but potent motivator. Farmers discovered that morale rations worked better than watchtowers. A grower in Texas told a local paper, "Men who eat like us work like us." In many towns, Sunday treats became ritual. Pitchers of lemonade, tins of fruit, and on occasion, churned ice cream shared under the shade of barns. Prisoners responded with diligence, harvesting, building, and canning at rates that often surpassed civilian crews. Reports from War Food Administration inspectors confirmed that productivity among POW laborers rose sharply wherever amenities mirrored those of the American workforce. The transformation was mutual. For the Americans who saw them daily, the captured soldiers ceased to be faceless enemies and became simply men, disciplined, courteous, and oddly grateful. The line between captor and captive blurred over shared meals and small kindnesses. Within the wire, the weekly ice cream ration grew into a symbol of earned respect, a message that cooperation, not defiance, preserved dignity. By war's end, thousands of these men would return to Europe with altered convictions, their first lessons in democracy delivered not through lectures, but through fairness and a bowl of ice cream. For the men who had marched under swastikas and desert suns, the world behind the wire in America carried a quiet, disorienting contradiction. They had been schooled to believe that democracies were soft, decadent systems, decaying under greed, chaos, and weakness. Yet here in Alabama and Oklahoma, they saw the opposite. Order without brutality, abundance without arrogance, and indulgence delivered with discipline. To the indoctrinated youth and hardened officers of the Reich, the contradiction was almost unbearable. A simple bowl of ice cream, served with the same precision as an ammunition ration, became a challenge to everything. They thought they understood about the enemy. The U.S. Army's Special Projects Division recognized the power of that contradiction and deliberately amplified it. The division's intellectual rehabilitation program began quietly in 1944, blending education with exposure. Selected prisoners were invited to attend film nights, showing American newsreels, westerns, and documentaries. English classes taught by Army instructors framed democracy not as chaos, but as participation. Camp newspapers, printed in both English and German, carried editorials on freedom of speech, responsibility, and even humor, concepts forbidden under Nazi censorship. The goal was not conversion by lecture, but erosion by example. When kindness came with consistency, ideology began to dissolve on its own. Inside the camps, the comparisons grew painful. Prisoners received steady meals, milk, and medical care, while their letters home, when they arrived, spoke of families living under blackout curtains, scrounging through ration coupons and ruins. The realization created a deep cognitive dissonance. How could a supposedly degenerate enemy provide more humanity in defeat than their own leaders offered in victory? One prisoner later recalled, "Our first doubts did not come from defeat, but from desert." For many, the American mess hall became their first glimpse of a civilization defined not by fear, but by confidence, a society that could afford compassion. As the war drew toward its end, this subtle re-education began to reveal its true strength. The same logistical machine that could freeze cream in Alabama had frozen something far greater in the minds of its captives, the notion that freedom could coexist with plenty, and that power need not be cruel to be absolute. It was this ideological taste, sweet, cold, and unforgettable, that would linger long after the barbed wire came down. In wartime America, even something as simple as ice cream was never just dessert, it was doctrine. The same impulse that brought frozen sweetness to prisoner compounds also kept frontline soldiers fed, rested, and unshaken across the globe. Behind every spoonful lay the unspoken creed of total morale warfare, the belief that victory depended as much on the spirit as on the rifle. From the Quartermaster depots of New Orleans to the forward bases of Saipan and Normandy, the logistics of comfort became a weapon of endurance. Nowhere was this clearer than in the Pacific, where the Navy's construction battalions, the Seabees, built entire floating ice cream barges out of converted tankers. Anchored among fleets battered by months of combat, these steel kitchens produced 10 gallons of ice cream every 7 minutes, delivering the frozen ration to destroyers, carriers, and troopships alike. In Europe, mobile field kitchens followed advancing divisions, their compressors humming beside mess tents as the front lines pushed deeper into occupied territory. Each scoop carried a message as potent as any broadcast. America's war machine could move forward without deprivation. German intelligence officers, intercepting Red Cross reports and prisoners' letters, saw the implications. If the enemy could spare cold storage for dessert in the middle of a global conflict, what else might it produce without limit? The realization struck deeper than any leaflet drop. Industrial abundance itself became psychological warfare, an argument that could not be refuted by ideology. Captured soldiers who once believed in Nazi depictions of Allied decay found themselves surrounded by a civilization that fought with both ferocity and comfort, power and decency intertwined. Allied generals understood this dual effect. High morale translated into precision, resilience, and momentum. Every sign of excess became a symbol of unbreakable supply. Inside POW camps, the same lesson played out in miniature. Sweetness delivered through discipline, compassion backed by machinery. In the end, America's ability to serve ice cream in a world at war was more than a logistical triumph. It was proof that material mastery could shape minds, that abundance itself could conquer belief. The war had been fought with steel and courage, but also, quietly, with refrigeration. By the end of 1944, the smooth rhythm of abundance that had defined America's prisoner of war camps began to strain under the pressures of global war. The same supply arteries that had carried frozen comfort across the continent were tightening. Sugar shipments were redirected to Europe, dairy allocations cut to sustain frontline hospitals and liberation zones. At some camps, the familiar hum of the refrigeration truck simply stopped. In Aliceville, weeks passed without the usual deliveries. In northern posts like Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, freezing weather made even the most efficient compressors unreliable. What had once seemed limitless began to flicker, an empire of supply meeting the limits of distance, fuel, and winter. Rumors moved faster than the trucks. Some prisoners whispered that ice cream had been withheld as punishment for misbehavior. Others believed certain camps were favored for cooperation. The truth was simpler but harder to accept. Even the United States could not make luxury infinite in wartime. Yet American officers understood that perception mattered as much as calories. To preserve morale, they replaced the missing desserts with whatever the depots could spare. Fruit pies, sweetbreads, or canned peaches served cold. The substitutions worked better than expected. Our German prisoner later wrote that the thought of fairness mattered more than the flavor. Still, the moral chemistry of kindness was delicate. As Germany's collapse neared in early 1945, the ideological fractures inside the camps widened. For moderates, humane treatment confirmed that the Reich had deceived them. For unrepentant Nazis, it deepened humiliation. Some saw every act of generosity as manipulation, every dessert as propaganda. Guards noted that comfort, once unifying, now drew lines between acceptance and resentment. In this final phase, even abundance proved fragile. A reminder that mercy could bewilder as effectively as malice. The contradictions born of that kindness would linger, shaping the uneasy transition from wartime captivity to post-war reckoning. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the long journey home began, not for soldiers of victory, but for the defeated men who had spent years behind American wire. Trains rolled out from camps across the South and Midwest, bound for ports in New York and New Orleans, their boxcars filled with men who carried more than duffel bags. They carried confusion, reflection, and memories that refused to fit within the propaganda they had once believed. Many expected hostility on return to Europe. Instead, they found themselves haunted by the civility of their captors. In the letters and memoirs that followed, a single image recurred with surprising tenderness: the taste of ice cream. It became shorthand for everything impossible they had witnessed: mercy in victory, discipline without cruelty, power that could afford kindness. Former POWs wrote of camp theaters, libraries, and debates, of American guards who discussed baseball rather than politics, of Sundays spent under trees with bowls of something cold that no one in Germany had tasted since 1941. For many, that sweetness marked the moment they began to question the ideology that had sent them to war. "We learned that freedom does not mean chaos," one recalled decades later, "and that compassion can be stronger than fear." Allied occupation officials would later echo this view, citing the American POW program as a living model for democratic re-education. What began as a logistical experiment in humane warfare ended as a moral export, a lesson in how prosperity, fairly shared, could reforge thought. In the United States, too, reflection followed. Newspapers and veterans' journals marveled that, even at the height of total war, the nation had refused to abandon its ideals. The image of the ice cream-fed enemy became part of American folklore. Half pride, half paradox, a reminder that true victory lay not only in force of arms, but in proof of conscience. Decades after the wire came down, the hum of the ice cream truck still lingered in memory. By the 1970s and 1980s, as veterans on both sides aged into storytellers, the tale resurfaced in memoirs, documentaries, and small-town museums. In Aliceville, Alabama, the old campgrounds, once rows of barracks and guard towers, had long since turned to pasture. Yet inside the Aliceville Museum, a restored olive-drab Quartermaster truck stood gleaming under fluorescent light, its refrigeration unit polished to a quiet shine. It had once carried cold cargo through the sweltering South, delivering what no prisoner expected to taste again: a spoonful of civilization. Former German POWs returned with their families, tracing memories across the red clay and pine shade, explaining to their grandchildren how an enemy's desert had rewritten their view of America. One visitor described it simply: "It was the day we began to understand freedom, not fear." Historians came to see this story as something larger than nostalgia. It represented an early expression of what would later be called soft power, the ability to win hearts through conduct rather than coercion. The United States had not only outproduced its enemies but had out-civilized them, wielding logistics as both muscle and message. The same Quartermaster system that had frozen cream in 1944 evolved into the post-war networks of refrigerated transport, frozen food distribution, and modern supply chains that would feed a peacetime world. Engineers who once kept ammonia compressors running in Alabama would go on to pioneer the cold storage infrastructure of supermarkets and interstates. Yet beyond industry, the ice cream truck endured as moral shorthand, a reminder that even in a world of destruction, humanity could persist through the smallest gestures. In the end, the symbol returned to where it began: an olive-drab truck under a southern sun, compressor humming softly, a faint echo of an age when abundance, tempered by mercy, became its own kind of victory. In the summer of 1946, as troopships cut across the Atlantic carrying the last German prisoners home, the war's noise had faded, but one memory refused to. It was not of battle or captivity, but of a single taste: cool vanilla melting under a hot American sky. For many who had fought beneath the Iron Cross, that flavor became the symbol of a paradox: defeat served with dignity. Behind them lay the fences of Alabama and Texas. Ahead lay the shattered remains of Bremen, Dresden, and Cologne. In the ruins their stories spread softly, of camp theaters, clean beds, and most of all of ice cream. Families listening in bombed-out kitchens struggled to believe it, that even as the world burned, the enemy had found room for kindness. The ice cream camps, as they came to be called, drifted into legend. Historians later traced them not as anomalies, but as glimpses of what civilization can be even in total war. The gesture was never about indulgence. It was proof of principle. Her nation, strong enough to share sweetness with its captives, was one that had mastered both conquest and conscience. For the men who tasted it, that lesson lingered long after the dessert was gone. In the end, it was not the cold treat that endured, but what it revealed, that true victory is measured not in destruction but in restraint, not in dominance but in decency. Amid the ashes of the 20th century's most brutal conflict, one truck, one delivery, and one simple kindness stood as quiet evidence that even in humanity's darkest hour, civilization did not melt away.